So there's this classic story about six blind men who go about trying to describe an elephant using their sense of touch. And one of them, after examining the elephant, describes it as a wall, the other a tree. A third, after touching the elephant, describes it as a rope. Yet another describes it as a snake. The fifth describes it as a fan, and the last one describes it as a spear. And what's happening here, you might guess, each of them, of course, is touching a different part of the elephant. The man who touches the wall, or says it's like a wall, is touching the side of the elephant, the rope, the tail of the elephant, the spear, the tusk of the elephant, so on and so forth. And what this story is supposed to illustrate is the limitations of our perceptions and the fallibility, the error-prone nature of our perception. It also shows that perception is a process, something that is done through kind of a collectivity of our senses. We are each limited in our ability to perceive the world. We have a limited number of sensory organs that allow us to take information in. And when we put all that information together, we get an incomplete picture. We are piecing the world together using bits and pieces of information that are continually shaping an ongoing understanding that we have of what's happening. And we do this like the blind men are in this example. We are recognizing certain patterns and comparing the data that's coming in to those pre-existing patterns that were probably shaped from our experiences. This is like a rope. I've had interactions with a rope before. This new thing that I'm feeling feels like a rope, or it's like a tree. So we're taking bits of information that were gathered through, in this case, the sense of touch, and we are putting it into something that is whole and has meaningfulness to us. And while their initial perceptions in this story are I guess, wrong in a kind of holistic sense, in a smaller scale, it's pretty accurate, right? It is like a rope. It is like a tree. It's like all of those things. So our perception is limited, and it's not always accurate exactly, but we aren't lost, right? There's no reason for the blind men to just insist on only touching one part of the elephant. It's just a story. Let's not get carried away about it. We've been doing perception our whole lives, and we're capable of really complex and accurate understandings of the world around us, at least enough to get most of our goals accomplished, right? We're able to do pretty incredible cooperation amongst each other to get things done. We've been doing this our whole lives, and we do it so well that oftentimes we're not really aware of all it is that we're doing. It's almost automatic. And we're just understanding the world. We take it for granted. We think we have an accurate understanding because it was effortless. And one of the things that we're trying to do in a communication studies course generally, and in this course in particular, is we're trying to take some of those unconscious things that we do in order to be able to communicate and make them more conscious to us. So a goal of this class is to become a more mindful communicator, more mindful of all the really micro work that we do to communicate. By the end of this class, we want to be able to both be able to, we want to be able to see communication in how it's working a little better. we want to be able to talk about communication and how it's working a little better. And of course, we want to make good choices as communicators. So this lecture is about the process of how our understanding of the whole is continually shaped by incoming messages that we receive, we sort through, we structure, we give meaning to the world around us. So before we jump into the 3 steps of the perception process, which are over here, selection, organization, and interpretation, let's take a look at where the perception process fits into some of our models of communication. In particular, we're going to look at a version of the transactional model of communication. And let's try to examine, all that is happening while we're trying to make sense out of the world. So this is a psychological model, if you remember the last lectures. And it's from the National Communication Association's website. And it kind of combines the 2 psychological models that I showed you in a previous video. And I just want to kind of talk through all that's going on here in this model. We have 2 people, right? 2 people who have 2 private internal worlds. And for whatever reason, they've come together. And each of them, as they are interacting with one another, is forming their own understanding of what is happening. And even further than that, they're also forming an understanding of what they think the other person is understanding. So I have my understanding of what's happening, and then I have what I understand you to be understanding. And they want to obviously try to understand each other as best they can, at least enough to accomplish whatever goals that they're trying to achieve. And while they're trying to achieve these goals, each is busy doing 2 different main activities, encoding and decoding. And when we're talking about encoding, we're talking about crafting a message for transmission, and we're often doing this intentionally, right? We send intentional messages that we are crafting consciously, and we're also we're encoding unintentionally certain messages as well. These are your nonverbal reactions that you're not controlling. These are things like maybe how you dress. Things like that. You control your dress, but maybe you don't think too much about the messages that are being sent there. You're sending unintentional messages based on how you're dressed. So in addition to encoding, we're also engaged in an activity of decoding. And that's where perception comes in. Really, we could use the terms decoding or receiving or perceiving when we're talking about the perception process. And that's what we're going to be focused on in the rest of this video and in some upcoming videos as well. What are we doing when we are decoding these messages? One of the things we are doing when we're decoding the messages is we're determining which of the messages are meaningful to us and worth attending to, as opposed to which are considered noise or interference or just data that's coming to us that we just don't deem worth attending to. So we have to sort through a bunch of different messages, because these messages, there's not just one or 2 at a time when 2 people are talking. These messages are sent along many different what we call channels of communication, both verbal channels and non-verbal channels. Verbal channels would of course include the spoken message, the sound system of language, as well as written messages that we might be encountering. The nonverbal is pretty complex, and we're going to talk about these in upcoming chapters. The nonverbal channels that we are receiving at the same time that we're receiving a verbal message include a variety of nonverbal signs, things like gesture, things like facial expressions, body movement, stance, eye contact, olfactics, surprisingly, which means smell. So we're taking in some sensory data through the sense of smell. Touch, it's much different in interaction if people are touching each other or not. Also, we touch certain objects. That is a way of communicating. Proximity, how close together or far away we are when we're talking to each other. We move in close, move away, that's meaningful. How each of us is dressed. Did you notice I'm wearing a different shirt? It's week 3, and I'm not as worried about impression management, where I'm trying to send you messages about who I am as you're beginning to form your initial impressions about me. We'll probably talk about impression management in the interpersonal chapter. So dress is something that we are receiving messages about. We have different orientations towards time and our shared understanding of how time is divided and used. We have different paralinguistic messages, the tone of our voice, the volume that we're using. It's much different to yell rather than to whisper to somebody. So we're taking not only verbal messages, but also nonverbal messages, a variety of them. And some of them line up with each other, some of them contradict each other. And so, clarity can be a little bit difficult when we're trying to put all of these messages together. And we're also reading these messages against a whole slew of contexts that are meaningful to us. And you have your understanding of the context, and I have my understanding of the context. Using this model up at the top, the context or kind of the background or situation that the communication is occurring in can be physical context, where physically is the communication taking place? Is it in a professor's office? Is it in a private home? Those are significantly different spaces in meaning to us. We also consider the psychological context, my own emotional state and condition. If I'm sad, that changes the context of our interaction. If you're sad or you're angry, or I think you are, that changes the context a bit in the meaning of what's being communicated. There's the relational context, the whole history of our relationship with one another. Are we strangers? Are we familiars? And there's also the kind of position we take to one another in relationship to power. One of us could be the other's supervisor, and that relationship would change the meaning significantly. And then there's social, cultural factors. A teacher-student context in the social situation of a classroom is much different than other types of interactions. And then there's the culture in which the communication is taking place that is also significant to us. So we're piecing together a bunch of different messages, and we're reading them against a bunch of different contexts. And again, you have your understanding, and I have my understanding. And we're trying to do this all despite a lot of noise that might be interfering with our decoding process. There are several different types of noise that we might consider. There's, of course, what we think of as physical noise, right? The environment is loud, and so I just can't physically hear you. There's semantic noise. We both have different understandings of the code and language that we're using. If one of us speaks a different language than the other, that's going to seriously interfere with our ability to communicate. If there's also, a psychological factor in noise. We have noise within our own minds that consists of things like your mood, if you're distracted or if you're tired. That could affect your ability to decode a message. But also it includes things like your personal biases, your prejudices, your past experiences that might skew your understanding of what's being communicated. And then lastly, there are physiological noises. Certain biological systems might not be working correctly. You might be deaf, for example, or hard of hearing, and that could affect your ability to decode certain messages. You might be sick at the moment you're communicating, and that's going to affect your decoding process. So clearly there's a lot happening when we try to make sense out of the world. And so it's no wonder that, yes, communication can create senses of understanding between people. And that's, ideally what we want it to do. But communication also creates misunderstandings. And we see that every day where people are kind of talking past one another, or they're fighting and having conflicts over meaning. So in this lecture, as we move forward, we're going to be examining the perception process in order to become more mindful of it and hopefully be able to check our perceptions in order to have a better understanding of what we think is going on. So let's get into what's going on with perception. What are we doing? Well, we're doing three primary activities. We are giving all of this data that's coming in through our senses stability, structure, and meaning, right? All of this data is coming in a constant stream of information, and we have to be able to attend to a certain part of it to kind of make it hold still, right? And say this part of it is meaningful enough to attend to. So we're giving it some stability and persistence in our minds. Further, we are structuring that all these multiple streams and channels of information. We're putting it together into a whole, a feeling of a whole, a kind of structure, and we are organizing it into recognizable forms. And then lastly, we're giving it some meaning. We're interpreting it. We are making sense out of it. We don't start without an understanding, right? We have an understanding always in operation, but that understanding and that meaning is being shaped as we're receiving more and more data. So we receive bits and pieces, but we perceive things as whole. And I wanted to illustrate that using these images here, which are from what's called Gestalt psychology. And it'll help us begin to think about social perception if we think about how visual perception works. And Gestalt psychology shows us that when we receive certain visual images from the world, our mind immediately imposes some kind of order upon it, and we perceive it as a whole thing. We don't perceive it as just a stream of little bits scattered. We perceive it as whole. And this is really illustrated by how we can kind of background and foreground these different images. So give it certain stability. The first image is kind of unstable because it can waver between an image of an old woman. Do you see the old woman? And the image of a young woman. And it could our mind can move back and forth between those, but it's imposing a kind of stability to only see one of those at once, and then we give it meaning. Oh, there's an old woman, there's a young woman. So to try to show you, you could see the young woman is looking over her shoulder and her chin and necklace. She's got a necklace right here, and she's wearing a big kind of fur and a hat, and her hair is coming out the top with a feather. Do you see that? And then the other one is the old woman. If you shift your kind of visual perception, the old woman, what was the young woman's chin is the old woman's nose. What was the young woman's necklace is her mouth. And I'm hoping you could see that shifting back and forth. We can usually only see one or the other because our mind is imposing a kind of wholeness to it. And you can see that in the middle one as well. A vase, if you're looking at the black text or the black part of the image as the foreground, and if you make the white part of the image the foreground in your mind, you might see faces. And same with this last one. So this illustrates the way in which the mind kind of imposes a whole upon what is a bunch of little bits together. Okay, so we're going to pick up in the next video with digging further into the perception process. And the perception process is outlined here as selection, organization, and interpretation. And it's an ongoing process. It's a process that helps us create a working understanding of the world. But that understanding can oftentimes be tinted with subjective elements and potentially errors. So we'll pick up there next video.